Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. Get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. I'm going to start off a little bit differently today and look at a little bit of our climate upcoming. This is starting a week from now, and then we'll go through one full week, so an 8 to 14 day forecast. This is the temperature slide. If you notice the gray over much of mainland Alaska, that means that we are expecting, or the highest probability is for temperatures to be near normal during that 8 to 14 day period. However, as we move over the eastern portions of mainland Alaska, we'll notice some of those shades of blue. That's going to lend towards higher probabilities of seeing temperatures below normals for that 8 to 14 day period for eastern portions of mainland. And then down in the Panhandle area, we're starting to see some of those warmer colors. That gives us higher probabilities to see above normal temperatures down in southeast for that week, or that day 8 to 14 temperature forecast. As we look at our precipitation, some of the warmer colors over the western portions of mainland Alaska extending down into the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, that shows that we are expecting or looking at the higher probabilities of having below average precipitation for the central and western portions of mainland Alaska for that 8 to 14 day window. However, over southeastern portions of mainland and for southeast Alaska, we're seeing some of those green shades showing that we are seeing above normal, or chances to be above normal for those areas of southeast mainland and southeast Alaska, looking for a little bit more precipitation in that 8 to 14 day time frame. Taking a look now at the one advisory we do have out for the state. This is in the Middle Tanana Valley. It is a winter weather advisory that is out for freezing drizzle. That is in effect until midnight tonight. So if you're driving on those roads, be particularly careful, as it could be some black ice situation on a lot of the roadways. I know that there have been reports of freezing drizzle in the Fairbanks area, so please be mindful of that. For a little bit more on freezing drizzle, it can form as a fine layer of ice during that freezing drizzle that's hard to notice on the roads. Again, it can look like water on the roadways, but is actually frozen. Instead of falling like snowfall or something that's easily visible, it falls as a super cooled water droplet that freezes on contact with frozen surfaces, resulting in instant ice, and can be incredibly dangerous, as it can lead to slippery roads and sidewalks and other things, especially things that are made out of materials that would be below freezing already. So please, again, be mindful of this if you're in the Middle Tanana Valley area, that we do have that winter weather advisory out for freezing drizzle. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll start off with the multiple lows that are moving up from the south, bringing a lot of warmer air to the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. One of those lows is south of the western Aleutians, and another one near the Sand Point area. As we look at this again, we can look over mainland Alaska. Can see that there's not a lot of higher cloud cover, but if you notice, you can see some of those darker clouds indicating the lower cloud cover, a lot of stratus out over the interior portion of the state, extending out further to the north as well. If we look out down in southeast, we can see some showers just off the coastline, but not a lot of activity out over the Panhandle. And then we can finally see a lot of the cloud cover extending in from our system to the south of Sand Point, starting to bring cloud cover to the Bristol Bay area as well as Kodiak Island. Taking a look now at the weather for the remainder of the day, we do have these multiple systems coming up, bringing a lot of rain throughout the southern and western portions of the Bering Sea, as well as throughout the Aleutian Islands, and making their way into the Alaska Peninsula as well. However, we do have that dominant high pressure out over the eastern portions of mainland Alaska that's starting to stall these systems, at least slow their progress. But there is a lot of stratus underneath this high pressure out over mainland Alaska, which is resulting in that freezing drizzle for the Middle Tanana Valley area, as well as some areas of rain and snow for the Kotzebue Sound area, more snow as we get up into the Brooks Range, and snow along the North Slope, as well as a mixture of snow and fog over the northwestern coastline. However, southwest Alaska, south central Alaska, and the Panhandle are going to be under the effects of this high pressure and should stay pretty dry through the remainder of today. As we move into tonight, that high pressure stays out over the eastern portions of mainland Alaska, and we'll keep the Panhandle area dry as well as south central and much of southwest Alaska. Still going to have some of the lingering freezing drizzle in the middle Tanana Valley. Again, that's going to be out until midnight tonight. Some areas of fog should also develop in northern portions of the interior to include the Yukon Flats throughout the night. And we'll see some snow over especially the eastern portions of the North Slope. As we drop down to our system coming up from the south, that front is going to start to push through the Aleutian Islands overnight tonight, bringing continued rain throughout all of the Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula and the majority of the southern portion of the Bering Sea, as well as starting to bring some rain to areas of Kodiak Island. The higher elevations will see some snowfall. As we look into Thursday, our high pressure holding pretty strong, so it's really slowing down the progression of our front. However, as we move into Thursday, we do expect some of that rain to start to make it into the southwest coastline, as well as continued rain for Kodiak Island, and then down in the Alaska Peninsula, and all throughout the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea. That high pressure will keep much of south central Alaska fairly dry, as well as down in the Panhandle area, and throughout the interior and much of the west coast as we get north of the YK Delta area. We have a weak cold front also moving through the Arctic coastline area, starting to bring some snow back to areas along the coast from Utqiagvik through to the east. As we move into Friday, that system progressively bringing moisture up further to the north and a little bit further inland. We're going to start to see more rain and snow mix in the more interior locations of southwest Alaska. However, it should be warm enough to see rain along the coastline of the southwest. Then in the Norton Sound area, again, we're going to see some mix of rain and snow as we get closer towards the Seward Peninsula area, but more rain, especially as we push out further west towards St. Lawrence Island area. That low spinning out there in the southern portion of the Bering Sea will continue to bring rain showers throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. We're going to see more rain for the Kodiak Island area, and some rain and snow starting to make it to the southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula. However, our dominant high pressure will keep the remainder of south central Alaska dry on Friday, as well as the Panhandle area, much of the interior, and along the Arctic coastline. However, we will see some lighter showers out by the Kaktovik area on Friday. Taking a look at our temperatures for Thursday morning, starting off in the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down into the lower 40s. It's also going to be true in the Alaska Peninsula. Down in the mid-30s for much of southwest Alaska. However, as we move further interior, we're going to drop down into the mid-20s and then eventually into the teens and single digits as we head towards the interior part of the state. As we get to central and eastern portions of the interior, some places are going to drop below zero. As you head back out west towards the Seward Peninsula area, dropping down towards freezing, and then into the 20s for areas along the Arctic coast. Down in south central Alaska, many interior locations into the teens, into the 20s near to the water, and colder in the Copper River Basin, -1 for Glen Allen. Down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down to the 20s for the most part, a little closer to 30 in southern locations. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into the 40s for southern portions of the Panhandle, into the mid-30s as we get further to the north. Coastal areas of south central into the 40s, interior locations into the 30s, once again colder in the Copper River Basin in the 20s there. 20s throughout much of the central interior, however, teens further to the east, and then near 30 degrees for areas further to the west. So you drop down into the southwestern portions of the state, getting up into the 40s, then the mid-30s for the Seward Peninsula area, and just above freezing for the Arctic coastline. Alaska Peninsula should get above 50 degrees, and then the upper to mid-40s for the rest of the Aleutian Islands. Friday morning lows dropping back down to the lower 40s for the Pribilof Islands as well as the Aleutians, mid-40s for the Alaska Peninsula, upper 30s for much of southwest Alaska near the coast, but again getting colder as we move further into the state. Going to be in the 20s as we get into the lower Yukon Valley and lower Kuskokwim Valley, and then in the single digits for much of the interior, and below zero for those eastern locations of the interior. Out by the Seward Peninsula, dropping down to the mid-20s, lower 20s for much of the Arctic coastline, in the 20s for much of south central as well, colder as we get more inland, and then warmer as we get near to the coast, up into the 30s for some of the coastal areas. Then down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the 20s at northern locations and down near freezing for the southern locations. Friday afternoon highs getting up to the 40s for southern portions of the Panhandle, mid-30s for northern locations, in the 40s for coastal areas of the south central area as well as many places in southwest Alaska. Then in the 30s as we move further to the north, and eventually in the 20s for the interior locations. Near 30 for much of the Arctic coastline, mid-30s for the Seward Peninsula, 50s for the Alaska Peninsula, and then mid to upper 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with 48 for St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with our front moving in, we are going to see quite a bit of IFR conditions out through the central Bering, down to the western Aleutians as well as the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Much of mainland Alaska in the southern areas should be VFR. However, as we get to interior locations and areas further to the north, we are going to see more MVFR and IFR conditions. IFR conditions will stretch from the Kotzebue Sound area up through much of the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle, expecting to see VFR conditions. Then on Thursday afternoon, more VFR conditions for the Panhandle area and much of the southern mainland again. However, as the front pushes closer, more of the MVFR conditions are going to move in around Bristol Bay and southern areas of the Kenai Peninsula. The interior should be primarily VFR, but we're still going to see more MVFR and IFR as we get up in the Brooks Range and the Arctic coastline. In the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we're going to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions with just some isolated areas of VFR. On Friday morning, the Bering Sea is going to fill in, be primarily MVFR and IFR, with the Aleutian Islands being primarily IFR as well as the Alaska Peninsula. And MVFR conditions are now going to extend into southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula and along the southwest coastline. Much of the rest of the mainland into the interior and south central should be VFR, but the Brooks Range and North Slope are going to continue to be MVFR and IFR. Down in the Panhandle area, VFR conditions are expected. Friday afternoon, continued VFR conditions for the Panhandle area, as well as much of South Central. However, those MVFR conditions along the Kenai Peninsula are going to creep ever further to the north. Going to see more MVFR conditions in southwest Alaska, but the interior should be VFR, and much of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline will be down in MVFR. For the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, IFR conditions are going to be the primary concern. For the passes starting up north at AKwx Pass, MVFR conditions are expected Thursday, as well as at Adigan Pass. So we move down into the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR throughout the day Thursday, as well as Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. Isabel Pass 2 should be VFR throughout the day Thursday, as well as Mentasta Pass and down at Tanita Pass. Portage Pass should also be VFR on Thursday, and Chilkoot and White both expected to be VFR all day Thursday. Looking at our freezing levels, our surface freezing line moves to southeastern Alaska and down along the North Gulf Coast, then out through southwest Alaska and up the west coast of the state. We have some warmer air coming up towards Kodiak Island area as that front is bringing up that push of southerly winds, and we are going to see freezing levels up to as high as 10,000 feet just to the south of Kodiak Island. Looking at our icing on Thursday out over the central and western Aleutian Islands, below or above 3,000 feet is expected, above 5,000 feet for the central Bering Sea, and below 2,000 feet up along the north slope. As we look down at our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is going to be over southeast Alaska, with winds getting up to as high as 130 knots out of a northwesterly direction, dropping down as we move along the North Gulf Coast to around 90 knots out for south central Alaska. Along the east coast or the eastern side of mainland Alaska, we are going to see northerly winds 70 knots and then westerly winds 75 knots along the Arctic coastline. Around our low pressure system by the central Aleutian Islands, we'll see some stronger winds on the eastern side of that low, up to as high as 110 knots out of a southwesterly direction, then dropping down to 70 knots as we get out over the Bering. On the back side of the low, we're looking at east and northeast winds up to as high as 65 knots. Down to 9,000 feet, we're going to see some stronger winds out through the Bering Sea. In the central Bering, we're going to see east to southeast winds up to as high as 70 knots. Down over the eastern Aleutian Islands, southerly winds 55 knots expected. The western Aleutian Islands on the other side of the low should be northeasterly around 60 knots. Over southwest Alaska, we're looking at southeasterly winds at 35 knots, dropping down to around 25 knots as we get over south central Alaska. Then up along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see westerly winds up to as high as 35 knots, with calmer winds out over the Panhandle. Down to 3,000 feet, still relatively light winds for the Panhandle area. However, we'll still see some stronger winds throughout the Bering Sea and Alaska Peninsula, getting up to as high as 75 knots out of a southeasterly direction. For the eastern Aleutians as well as the central Aleutians, southerly winds of 40 knots expected. Out over the western Aleutians, a little bit stronger northeasterly winds up to as high as 55 knots. Then along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see winds out of a west and northwest direction, 35 knots out west, getting up to as high as 45 knots for eastern locations. And finally, down by the Norton Sound area, easterly winds up to as high as 40 knots are expected. As we look at our turbulence, some of those stronger winds around the Bering, we do expect turbulence around the Bering as well. For the central and western Aleutian Islands, expecting turbulence below 3,000 feet. Up by the St. Lawrence Island, below 3,000 feet is also expected. Then along the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and southwest Alaska up towards the Norton Sound area, below 5,000 feet is expected.
Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining us once again is our good friend Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. Thanks again for joining us, Eric. We really appreciate it, as always.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks. And, you know, we're going to ask you some more satellite questions here, but, you know,
Okay.
since you're a regular guest, we're going to give you a riddle this time, kind of a trick start to the show.
Okay.
How do you see a polar bear in a snowstorm?
Sounds like a challenging question because
Okay.
the polar bear is white and the snowstorm's white.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Well, in the world of satellite meteorology, you couldn't, because the spatial resolution of this instrument that we're going to talk about today has 375 meters resolution, and even the most well-fed polar bear will not be 375 meters across.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to run into such a
No, that'd be a
creature,
bad day.
would you? In the satellite meteorology world, the equivalent would be, how do you tell the difference between clouds and then an area that has no clouds but's covered by snow,
Right.
a piece of ocean that has no clouds but has sea ice?
Ah.
All three of these are white. The
Right.
snow, the clouds, the sea ice, it's all white. So how, using satellite data, can you tell someone where the clouds are and where the clear areas are? This is important for aviators. Mariners want to know, in the ocean there, this white stuff, is that sea ice or is that just a cloud?
Right.
How do we tell the difference? And it turns out, if you look, say, at a picture of Alaska from the springtime, March or April, and it's high noon, so we're getting a lot of sunshine. If you were riding on a satellite with your human eye, look down, everything's white.
Right.
And we've got a picture of Alaska from early April, and we're seeing some of the lower elevations in south central Alaska are melting out, getting some brown ground there, but otherwise there's a whole lot of white on the image. What areas are cloudy, but what areas are clear and covered by snow or ice?
Okay.
It turns out that if we leave the visible spectrum behind a little bit, see, a satellite has multiple channels in the electromagnetic spectrum that it can look at.
Oh, okay.
Part of that's visible light, what we
Right.
see as humans, but there's a lot going on at other wavelengths. If we add in something that's called near infrared, what we couldn't quite see, but we're getting into that infrared territory, there's a magical property that we can exploit.
Secrets to find. Okay.
Oh yeah, this is actually powerful and almost magical, that at a slightly longer wavelength, when the sun shines down on Alaska and then it bounces off back to the satellite, at that near infrared wavelength, it turns out that snow and ice will absorb that wavelength, but liquid water, like liquid droplets in a cloud, will reflect it back.
Okay.
And that's not the way it works in visible. You know, visible, it just bounces off of all those targets the same. But at near infrared, snow and ice absorbs it, and the liquid will reflect it back. Liquid cloud droplets will do that.
Okay.
And so an image where everything looks white suddenly becomes colorful.
Oh,
And the way this recipe works is that the clouds look pink, and the snow-covered ground and the ice-covered ocean look blue. Suddenly now, we're able to see the polar bear in the snowstorm. We're able to see where the clouds are and where the snow is and where the ice is. This is a powerful advantage. Consider the case zooming into the Bering Strait area. What if you were asked to brief a pilot who wanted to fly, say, from Kotzebue down to Savunga or Gamble, and had to fly VFR, visual flight rules, so they had to stay out of the clouds? Could you use a satellite image where everything is white to provide that pilot any guidance?
It'd be pretty tricky.
Very tricky. And that's why we have to go to this other recipe where the all-white polar bear in the snowstorm becomes more colorful. And now we can tell the pilot, aha, this is a cloud you want to stay out of, but over here, sure, it looks white in the visible spectrum, but what we're doing, we'll show you, oh, this is just snow-covered ground, but it's clear, so you can fly right through there, visual flight rules. Same thing for a mariner who might want to get down to St. Lawrence Island, say, but has to avoid the sea ice. This product has applicability there as well.
Wonderful.
It's an amazing new technology, so many new channels. The satellite that makes this imagery actually has 22 different channels that it looks at.
22 secret decoder rings.
22 secret decoder rings.
Okay. You know, I liken this to an activity I had in the car when I was growing up. We go on long car rides, and we do all the work in these activity books to, you know, stay calm, cool, and collected for our parents who are trying to get us across the state. But to get the answer, the real answer, you had to apply that red sheet to see the answer or the secret path or whatever the message was in that activity book to get you onto the next page. And it's also like a photography filter, right? If you're taking a lot of pictures, you can apply different colors to see different parts of that image. I mean, that sounds a lot like what you're talking about.
Oh, you know it. The information is in there all along. We just have to combine the channels in a way to reveal what's in there. And by the way, you're dating yourself. So you didn't have an iPad in the back of the car?
No, sir.
Right? Okay. Well, we have, lastly, for dessert, there's a great image of the same kind of recipe. We're looking at South Central Alaska the first week of January. In first week of January, the sun, even at noon, is really low on the horizon, barely up. And in this image, the fun thing is the shadow of Denali. We can see the shadow of Denali over a lower pink cloud deck.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And Denali at 20,000 feet casts a big shadow. So this is another, just for fun, kind of application here. This is called multispectral satellite imagery, and it's the future. And happily, the future is now.
Oh, that is fascinating. And 22 different secrets that can be revealed from just one satellite tool that's floating overhead. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again. We can't wait to have you back and telling us more secrets of satellite technology that are passing over us every single day, many times a day, over Alaska and helping us all the way in many different parts of our lives. So thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, happy to be here.
All right. And thank you for staying with us. We'll be back with a little more weather here in just a few minutes. And of course, we'll have more Alaska weather facts anytime online.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We can see that we do have ice along much of the Arctic coastline, as well as the majority of the Beaufort Sea is still now iced in. However, some of those areas holding on. And then down in the Norton Sound area, we are starting to see some ice as well, especially in the more northeastern locations. As we look down into southeast Alaska, for our Thursday marine forecast, northwesterly winds in the inside waters, 15 knots in southern locations, getting up to as high as 25 knots sustained as we get into Lynn Canal, with gusts up to as high as 40 knots. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, easterly winds 20 to 25 knots for the eastern part of the Gulf, and then northern Gulf is going to be easterly 15 to 20 knots. For Friday in the inside waters, northerly winds 25 knots in the Lynn Canal area, becoming 10 to 15 as we get further to the south, and eventually switching over to northwesterly. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, all winds are going to be out of the east, 20 to 25 knots in the eastern Gulf and 15 knots in the northern Gulf. For South Central Alaska on Thursday, Gulf water is going to be east, and the northern locations 20 to 25, and then 30 to 35 knots as we get to western locations of the Gulf. In Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 15 knots are expected. Cook Inlet, northeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots. And then west of the Barren Islands, easterly winds 35 knots expected. Seas up to as high as 15 feet, highest west of the Barren Islands. On Friday for South Central Alaska, continuing to see easterly flow throughout the Gulf of Alaska, and 15 to 25 knots in northern locations, 30 to 35 knots out west, 40 knots out of the easterly direction west of the Barren Islands, seas up to as high as 17 feet there. In Cook Inlet, northeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots, and in Prince William Sound, easterly winds 10 knots expected. On Thursday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, by Kodiak Island, east to northeast winds 40 to 45 knots, get up to as high as 50 knots south of Kodiak Island out of an easterly direction, with seas up to as high as 21 feet, dropping down to 20 knots and becoming southerly winds as we get on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula near Sand Point. We're also going to see 50-knot winds out of the easterly direction in Bristol Bay, and then 35 knots out of a southeasterly direction as we get closer towards Cold Bay. On Friday, out over the Kodiak Island area, east to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, seas up to as high as 17 feet east of the island. Then becoming southerly 30 to 35 knots for the remainder of the Alaska Peninsula on the Pacific side. And on the Bering side, southerly winds 30 to 40 knots, strongest by Bristol Bay. For Thursday around the Aleutian Islands, we're going to see flow circulating around a low pressure system near the central Aleutian Islands. That's going to leave southerly winds for the eastern Aleutians, 30 to 40 knots, strongest on the Pacific side. For the western Aleutians, northerly winds around 45 knots, seas up to as high as 24 feet by the western Aleutians. For the central Aleutians, flow moving around the low southerly on the Pacific side 30 knots, easterly on the Bering side 30 knots there as well. For Friday for the Aleutians, for the eastern Aleutians, southerly winds 35 knots, easterly or westerly winds for the central Aleutians 30 knots, and then north to northwest winds 30 to 35 knots for the western Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, all easterly flow up by the Norton Sound area 30 knots, 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island, 40 knots north of Nunavik Island, 50 knots south of Nunavik Island, 45 knots for the Pribilofs, and 45 knots also for St. Matthew Island, with seas up to as high as 22 feet through much of the central and northern Bering. As we look into Friday along the west coast, northern locations still out of the east, 30 knots in Norton Sound, 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island, 35 knots also north of Nunavik Island. Southeasterly winds as we get south of Nunavik Island, 30 knots, and 30 knots also for the Pribilof Islands, and the northeasterly winds 40 knots for St. Matthew Island. Along the Arctic coastline on Thursday, westerly winds 30 knots expected, becoming southwest 25 to 30 along the northwest coast, and then switching over to easterly as we get by the Kotzebue Sound area at 20 knots and then 35 knots south of the Bering Strait. On Friday along the Arctic coastline, variable winds 10 knots, becoming easterly 20 knots along the northwest coast, 30 knots out of the east for Kotzebue Sound area, and 35 knots out of the east near the Bering Strait. Quick recap of our weather for tonight. Rain throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula from a system coming up from the south. High pressure going to start to stall that system, resulting in drier conditions for much of mainland and the southeast. However, we will still have the winter weather advisory out for freezing drizzle for the middle Tanana Valley, valid until midnight tonight. And then we'll also have some snow along the Arctic coastline. Moving into Thursday, high pressure for much of the state, rain throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and now pushing into southwest Alaska as well as Kodiak Island. Some other areas of snow up along the Arctic coast and dry elsewhere.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.